is live, yes. We are live. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm Ivo Dollar, the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and truly delighted to have Secretary Ernest Moniz here with us this morning. As you know, we organized this breakfast at very short notice and in short order, but we could not be more delighted with the opportunity to hear directly from Secretary Moniz on the provisions and the implications of the Iran agreement. The Council recently conducted an opinion poll, as we do every year, on this and many other topics, and we released the results of this particular poll on July 6th. That is just before the agreement was concluded. That survey indicated that a majority of Americans supported the broad outlines of an agreement with Iran to limit its nuclear program to civilian uses. However, the public prefers a diplomatic solution, and majorities, although the public prefers a diplomatic solution, majorities also appear willing to use force to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear weapons state. There's much more data to be found in the report, which is available from our website. The format for today's breakfast is as follows. We'll have brief introductory remarks from Secretary Moniz, followed by a roundtable discussion, which I will moderate. Today's discussion is on the record. Indeed, we are live streaming, so you are welcome to tweet, pin, and do everything else that social media allows you to do, but do it with your phones silenced, please. Before we welcome the Secretary to comment on the deal and the subsequent debate that we're having in this country, I'd like to take a moment to touch on the few of his many accomplishments. Secretary Moniz was sworn in as the Secretary of Energy in 2013. Before his appointment, he was a professor of physics and engineering systems at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, heading its physics department and being the founder of the MIT Energy Initiative. He served under President Bill Clinton as Undersecretary of the Department of Energy, and also in the Executive Office of the President as the Associate Director for Science. He sits on a number of boards and commissions, including President Obama's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, the Department of Defense Threat Reduction Advisory Committee, and the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future. Please join me in welcoming to the Chicago Council Secretary Ernest Moniz.
Well, thank you, Ivo, and thanks to the Council for hosting this discussion, and thanks to all of you for a mid-August breakfast to talk about the Iran agreement. I can assure you I would be delighted to also lapse into discussing things like energy technology, innovation, and climate change, the road to Paris, the road from Paris, but I think today we're here to discuss the Iran agreement. So let me give something of a chapeau for the discussion, and then engage in listening to you and answering questions as I can. First of all, we should recognize, of course, that the President made a strategic choice, one which I certainly endorse, and that was to have a negotiation that focused on the existential threat of a nuclear weapon in Iran. And as I will come back to, that is the issue of preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon is one that clearly has very, very strong support in the international community. Now, having said that, let's go to the agreement itself. First of all, I think it's important to recognize kind of at the highest level that the agreement has a commitment from Iran to the United States and the rest of the negotiators, but to the United States, to never have a nuclear weapon. That is not a 1, 10, 20 year commitment. It's a forever commitment. Now, sure, we have the NPT commitment, we have a fatwa, but this is a direct commitment of Iran to the United States, and at least in my view, that for the long term, should there become an issue of noncompliance, gives us somewhat different standing and authority in terms of a strong response. Having said that, now the question is how. How do we move forward? How do we, in particular, have strong verification possibilities? Okay, so let me say what's the basic construct of the agreement that we reached with the P5+1 and Iran. The basic construct is that for 15 years, there are strong, direct physical constraints, if you like, in terms of what Iran can do in their presumably peaceful nuclear program. Those constraints, I don't want to go into great detail, but they address both the uranium and plutonium pathways to a weapon. On the uranium or enrichment side, as you know, there are strong constraints on what they can use in the next 10 years, how much they can spin. But in particular, let me say, as an example of a very strong constraint, it is the 15-year constraint on only 300 kilograms of low-enriched uranium compared to the approximately 12,000 kilograms that they will have on implementation day, on eliminating 20% material, 20% enriched material. That is, at least that's not in these complex fuel plates for their research reactor. So those are our strong constraints, and fundamentally, they all come together in our national laboratories, including, by the way, Argonne National Laboratory here in your neighborhood, have and Alan Schriesheim I see there. Speaking of Argonne, that our labs were integral to seeing that we came to an agreement that satisfied the president's criterion that there would be a one-year breakout time to sufficient fissionable material for a first weapon for at least 10 years, compared to the current, say, 2 months or so. In fact, I'll say right now that we'll probably come back to this, that many say, oh, but after 15 years, Iran could become a threshold state. Iran is a threshold state. Iran was a threshold state when these negotiations started. What this agreement does is move them considerably back from that threshold for a considerable period of time. On the plutonium pathway, it's funny, just a few years ago, the Iraq reactor as a plutonium pathway was the central element of addressing Iran's program. Hardly hear it mentioned anymore, because that pathway is really kind of stone cold stopped. The reactor itself will be redesigned to make an order of magnitude less plutonium. The current design could produce somewhere between 1 and 2 weapons worth per year. This is an order of magnitude reduction, but in a good belt and suspenders approach. Not only will it make far less plutonium than one would need for any kind of breakout scenario, but all the spent fuel containing the plutonium will be sent out of the country for the entire life of the reactor. So the plutonium pathway is also cut off. Now, I'm not going to go into much more detail unless you wish to in the questions, but of course, having said all of that, and given strong verification measures for the declared facilities, Iraq, Fordo, Natanz, a real issue, of course, is what about verification for any covert pathway? Undeclared facilities, suspicious facilities or locations suspected of engaging in activities relevant to a nuclear weapons pathway. Here, the first thing is to recognize that there is, again, a forever aspect to this in terms of the additional protocol being adhered to forever, and of course that's the basis of access to undeclared sites. However, we have additional protocol plus, and I'll give you 2 examples where the agreement breaks new ground in important ways on the plus to the additional protocol. Number one, let's face it, a shortcoming of the additional protocol is that there's no time frame in which the country needs to cooperate with the IAEA once it asks for access within 24 hours to a site. So the first thing that is quite unique here is that there is a fixed time frame. So the debate, if you like, between Iran in this case and the IAEA can go on for 2 weeks. But after that, it's cut off, and then there's a 10-day period involving a joint commission and then access provided, or Iran is in material breach of the agreement. So I'll come back to the famous 24-day argument, but what I want to first emphasize is this is unique in having a fixed time frame within a well-defined process to have access. A second example of a step out from conventional the conventional arrangements is a uranium supply chain transparency surveillance for 25 years. Of course, in the end, it's all about following the nuclear material. We know that there's a lot more needed for a weapon, but the material is kind of the long pole in the tent. And having this supply chain visibility for 25 years is quite significant. It means that if there is a covert attempt for a weapons program, you have to basically recreate an entire supply chain. Every aspect going all the way back to the uranium, covertly, successfully hiding all the links in that chain. You can imagine and certainly rest assured that our intelligence community and those of other countries view that as an enormous benefit in terms of visibility into the program. Not that we don't have significant means already, but this really adds to it. In fact, Jim Clapper, General Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, said just last week that while no one's going to stand up and say there is absolutely 100.0% certitude in finding everything done in a covert manner, the fact is this agreement would provide dramatically increased transparency, and that basically raises the risk threshold very, very substantially if Iran wanted to again establish this covert path. So that's those are some of the key features of the in some sense the nuclear dimensions of the agreement. Now let me say just a few words on some other aspects of the agreement, and then we can open it up. First of all, I think a very important point is the remarkable unity and cohesion among the P5+1. And obviously this occurred at a time when some members of the P5 have some issues to resolve, and yet here there was complete cohesion. It's very important. For one thing, this is one aspect, and I'll come to the sanctions unity of purpose as well. This really shows again, as I said earlier, a very, very broad commitment to Iran not having a nuclear weapon. I believe it also reflects, especially for the P5, that there is a strong self-interest in the P5 to preserve and strengthen, if possible, the non-proliferation regime based in the NPT. Obviously, the P5 have a special role in the NPT, and this self-interest, I think, is one of the factors that also gives us confidence in a continuing unity should there be a challenge to this regime in the future. Secondly, another example, of course, of the unity in the international community is the sanctions regime. We all know that the unilateral sanctions have never proved to be particularly effective, but it was the diplomacy that led to U.S., EU, UN Security Council sanctions, supplemented by voluntary actions by India, China, Japan, South Korea, in terms of limiting oil purchases from Iran, on top of the complete embargo on that in the European Union. Those sanctions together obviously had bite. They have probably reduced the Iranian economy by about 20%, and it was that solidarity that brought them to the table. Now, it's very important to remember that the reason for those sanctions and the reason for that unity was that the sanctions were to bring Iran to the table. They came to the table. They signed an agreement. So basically, we have a very hard-won unity that is the basis not only of the agreement, but again, of a future response should Iran violate the agreement. However, as often happens, a very hard-won over years unity can be lost extremely quickly, specifically in this case if the Congress were to undercut the agreement, because there is no doubt that we would be viewed as the outlier in terms of an agreement that again was negotiated in a very complex way on a complex subject over years. Iran will have been viewed as having satisfied its requirements, and we will have been viewed as not having done so. So that's, I think, a very important point. But in fact, I should say that it is very clear, and frankly, in discussions between European ambassadors and our Congress, it has been made very, very clear that if this agreement is undermined, there will be no new negotiation. I mean, largely for the reasons I just described. Now, let me just say that, having said all of that, there is an asymmetry in the sense, a big asymmetry in the sense that, frankly, what we have, quotes, given up is Iranian access to their funds in escrow in various places. By the way, this number, various numbers get tossed around. 150 billion, as Jack Lew has made clear. The number is something over 50 billion. Now, having said that, it's still a big number. I mean, on the scale of the Iranian economy, there's no question about that. But it's also the case that largely as a result of sanctions, they've built up about a $500 billion hole that has to get filled. Having said that, no one's saying that some amount of those funds will not go into military directions. We have to face that. But again, our idea is that, President's idea is that take the existential threat off the table, and now, however, go back and focus very hard now on pushing back with our allies and friends on all the other issues that are at play with Iran, sponsoring terrorism, Hezbollah, regional instability, Syria, human rights violations, for example, Americans held in Iran, and frankly, completely unacceptable, obviously, anti-Semitic language in terms of the State of Israel. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there that we have to confront and, if anything, raise the game. And a good example was just this week, John Kerry with the Gulf countries having the enhanced security activities that are important in addressing their concerns, especially from Syria to Yemen. Now, having said that, the last point I'll make is it should be very, very clear that this agreement in no way changes the equation as to who our friends and allies are in the region. It's Israel and the Arab countries with whom we work, plain and simple. And certainly, as far as Iran coming into the international fold, I think that can only happen after all those other issues I just listed are addressed. So, in summary, we think that this agreement quite clearly addresses the objective of this negotiation of preventing the pathway to a nuclear weapon in Iran, or, should they try it, provide the visibility for sufficient warning that we can take responses as needed. And clearly, one prefers diplomatic responses, one prefers economic pressure, but as the President's made clear, regrettably, the military option has to remain also on the table should Iran break out towards a nuclear weapon. Thank you. Ivo, I think we should open it up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. So if you would like to ask a question, put your placard up this way, then I will recognize you. Let me start off the question with something you said you were going to talk about, so I'll give you the opportunity to talk about it, which is the 24 days.
Oh, yes.
And in particular, the question of what you think can be done to hide whatever is being taken care of in those 24 days, and what cannot when it comes to verifying
Right.
what may or may not be happening in these sites.
So let me just slightly expand your question into two coupled issues, which is the 24 days and the so-called secret side deals. First of all, the secret side deal is a complete red herring. It's a very good messaging, apparently, but is just a red herring. The agreement, the JCPOA, the agreement succeeds in its objective, which is to require Iran to finally comply with the IAEA's needs to close the PMD book, possible military dimensions of previous activity. I want to emphasize, of course, I say close the book. It's not like this is opening the book. That book has been open for a long time, and the IAEA, and frankly, unclassified U.S. national intelligence estimates have made it clear that we understand that up to 2003, Iran had a structured program that was looking at technologies of relevance to nuclear weapons and was doing undeclared work with uranium. So we know that. But for the integrity of the process, we think it's extremely important to close the book. And Iran has not cooperated. With this agreement, they must not only cooperate, they must cooperate by October the 15th to provide the IAEA with the access that the IAEA defines as its requirement. Then, as is standard, so we did our job. Then, as is standard, the IAEA, with the country, works out the protocols for getting the necessary access as defined by the IAEA. That's what they have done, and such protocols are always safeguards confidential. Now, with Iranian cooperation, the IAEA has committed to finishing its report by the end of this year. Mid-December is the target. And of course, that report will be available to the Board of Governors of the IAEA, including the United States, in terms of summarizing the whole picture, including what they learned in this last period. So I think it's useful to get that kind of out of the way. Now, in the 24 days, as we said, this is, first of all, new in the sense of having this finite time. So what issues does 24 days pose in terms of covert activities? Number one, we have said quite clearly that we are very confident in finding the vestiges of work with nuclear materials in the presumed face of strong attempts to clean up the use of that material. Remind you, we have an historical example in Iran in 2003 when the IAEA was strung out for 6 months in gaining access to a facility in Tehran. There were strong attempts to clean up. It was found. They caught red-handed, basically. In addition, while I cannot go into the details, in our laboratories, we have also done experimental work to probe the limits of cleanup of the vestiges of work with uranium. Our experts have not succeeded in that attempt. So we feel very strong about that, whether it is enrichment or whether it's, for example, work with uranium metal in the kind of program that one would carry out for a nuclear weapon. Now, let's move on to other aspects, however. And first I should say, of course, in the agreement, and this is a complete change from the Lausanne parameters, from Lausanne to Vienna, not because we had failed in Lausanne, we just hadn't raised the issue yet in Lausanne, and that is Iran has also prohibited from a whole set of weaponization activities. Forever. Metal for 15 years, but forever no work on, excuse the technicalities, but explosively driven neutron sources, which you can easily imagine why they are relevant. No work on multi-point detonation systems of relevance to an implosion. No procurement of specialty equipment for a weapons program, like very fast streak cameras. And no computation of nuclear explosives. Now, clearly, I took actually an order of those in the direction in which sampling becomes more and more difficult. Getting, of course, to the limit where sampling is not relevant for looking at computations of nuclear weapons. There are other means for looking at what is going on in terms of computations. But if I go up to the go upstream in that set of activities, even with no nuclear materials involved, things like special neutron initiation do leave signatures that one can look for. But clearly, these get more and more difficult. But as we know in this business, it isn't always about finding the specific molecule that you're looking for. It's also contextual. The IAEA or the intelligence services have to understand activities and context, where they occur, why they occur, keep pulling on threads. So I think, when all is said and done, it is a very, very strong verification regime, and the 24 days certainly is something that we think, with high confidence, we can live with.
Thanks very much. Marilyn Diamond, a member of our board.
Thank you so
If
much.
you please wait, because if you
thank
want to be heard on the live stream, you
okay.
need to do that.
Thank you for your comments. They've been very enlightening. My question has to do with sanctions, and I'm interested in the time frame that the snapback sanctions involves, what that process looks like, as well as I have a question on the SWIFT banking provision, and does that require the agreement of the P5+1, or can that be independently done by, say, the United States?
Well, on the snapback provisions for the UN Security Council sanctions, I trust you mean, yeah. There again, there's a well-defined process. It's a 60-day process to restore the sanctions. I do want to emphasize 2 points, however, there as well. Number one is that the snapback can be in whole or in part. So it is not just a purely blunt instrument of restoring all sanctions. One can have a graded response in that snapback. Secondly, and this is quite remarkable, the P5, in effect, gave up their singular veto option in the sense that with this negative vote structure, any one country in the agreement can snap back the sanctions. So specifically, we have that capability ourselves. Now, obviously, as I said earlier, the issue of unity among the group is not something to take lightly, but the reality is we have the ability to do that. With regard to the SWIFT issue, and I, of course, should say it's unfortunate you don't have Jack Lew sitting here rather than me for that question. But once again, having Iran not in the SWIFT system is clearly a tremendous constraint on their financial approaches. But this, in the end, we go back to this question of unilateral versus multilateral sanctions. Certainly, if the United States were to play the SWIFT card unilaterally and contemplate sanctions on, let's say, central banks of major economies, let's be honest, that's not going to be something very easily done. And the history shows that such kinds of actions typically are in suspense. So I think the bottom line is that we have a lot of tools. Our unilateral sanctions are not to be dismissed, but we have seen the value of maintaining unity, and I think that will be critical going forward.
Next, Jamie Sprayregan, another member of our board.
Thank you, Secretary, for your presentation. I have a two-part question. One on the 24 days. I've seen a number of commentators say that 24 days in a number of circumstances could be extended far past the 24 days by Iranian activities where they don't have to give the access within that time period. And then that's a specific and more general. The argument concerning Congress not being able to disapprove this because of the repercussions that would occur and that the only alternative is war. I'm curious as to why that's the case, in the sense that there's been previous treaties, this isn't a treaty, but treaties turned down by Congress, and then there's been renegotiation, and then those have gotten done. Why is the only alternative war?
Well, first of all, on 24 days getting strung out, said earlier, the way this starts is that the IAEA would follow its conventional approach of having been helped, let's say, the agency, to focus on a particular location as suspicious based upon intelligence provided by whoever. Then they ask for access to that place within 24 hours. Then, as I said, historically what's happened is that 24-hour access may not be granted, and a long process may follow. Days, months, years, who knows? So here, as I said, the first part of the 24 days is actually 14 days for the agency and Iran to work out the issue. But so it's saying you can't go on with that for months and years. It's 14 days. What's critical is that the IAEA, and we have a lot of confidence in this, if the 24-hour access is not granted, that they don't get into a long discussion before, if you like, pulling the trigger on the formal request for access. That's what sets the clock off. And that gives them the 2 weeks to resolve it, or put it into the channel of the Joint Commission, and that's the 10-day process by which time access must be granted. So we don't believe this is a rope-a-dope for dragging this out for a long time, because the IAEA will have every reason after the 24 hours to say, okay, let's do a 2-week negotiation and see if we can't work this out. In terms of the repercussions, well, as I've said, the unity among the P5+1 is quite remarkable, and we should remember that whatever view we have of the reasons for the sanctions, such as punishment for a broader set of activities, let's say, the international community and the UN sanctions were very clearly put in place with the explicit purpose of negotiating. And that's been done. So as I say, we will be presumably quite isolated, and it's already been made clear that there will not be a renegotiation. Frankly, it puts Iran into a greater position of strength as one who has come to the table and negotiated agreement that everybody else in the world seems to think is a good agreement, in the sense of giving certainly a chance for diplomacy to resolve this whole issue of Iranian nuclear weapons peacefully. Now, on war, I think the president has said, he didn't say that there's war on day one, but the prospect of war at some point is real, in the sense that Iran will be in a position, and we don't know what Iran's response would be. Iran's response could be full-out resumption of everything they're doing in nuclear. It could be a partial response to strike a balance that tries to, let's face it, divide the international community. In that situation, what will our position be? Clearly, Iran, I think clearly, these are always speculations, but I think quite clearly, will Iran, I'll ask as a question, will Iran get rid of its 12,000 kilograms of low-enriched uranium? I think the answer to that is pretty obvious. That in and of itself is a huge threshold state issue. A big part of the year breakout, it comes from that limit on the enriched stockpile. So all of this will be happening without anything like the verification measures we have here. So what happens if our intelligence community then, has indications of very suspicious activity, but we don't have access? I mean the agency, does not have access. So that's the issue of, if, and we do, I shouldn't say if, with a bright line about Iran not having a nuclear weapon program, clearly the military option is going to be in very serious play because of the threshold nature of the activity and the lack of verification. So that's what this agreement does. It blocks the pathway. It provides the verification built on a direct commitment from Iran to not develop a nuclear weapon or acquire, I should have added, or acquire a nuclear weapon, and never to engage in a whole set of essential weaponization activities for a weapon program.
Rachel Bronson, the Executive Director and Publisher of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists.
Thank you. Good morning. I was exactly that point. I was hoping you could elaborate on the never and the forever, because we hear a lot about dates, but when you, in your opening remarks, you said in the additional protocol, they will never commit to that. Could you elaborate on that, since the public conversation is more about, well, 10 years they can start doing this, 15 years they can start doing that. You mentioned, obviously, the NPT and the fatwa, but what's in the additional protocol to underscore your point, never and forever?
Well, again, the additional protocol, as I said, I think I said earlier, the key feature of the additional protocol is this access to undeclared sites. And of course, that in itself has roots in some unpleasant history, like the North Korea, et cetera, where there was extremely limited access and certainly no access to undeclared facilities. So that is the underpinning is this access to undeclared suspicious sites, and that will be forever. But as I said, all the way up through 25 years. And by the way, I should have said that there is also a forever commitment to modification 3.1, which means that Iran, in contrast to current practice, must notify the agency when a decision is taken to construct any nuclear facility, as opposed to a notification when a nuclear facility is built and is about to operate. We don't talk about it so much, but that is another feature of the agreement. So the idea is we have that forever. We have the weaponization commitments forever, and we have strong enhancements of the verification regime, additional enhancements through 25 years.
Great. Next, Emma Belcher from the MacArthur Foundation.
Thanks very much, and thanks for being here today. It's a great opportunity. You'd mentioned the sense of P5 unity, and I believe you also mentioned their sort of self-interest in strengthening the MPT. And now we have the additional protocol plus and the sort of 24-day mechanism. I'm wondering where you see this going and the implication on the regime in general, and whether this might provide a future model. And on that point, was there much consideration given in the negotiation and the discussion among the P5 about the implications of this for the regime down the line, or was that really not much of the focus, and the focus was solely on Iran?
Well, clearly the focus was on Iran, obviously, but I will just say that without getting into too many specifics or naming names for sure, that as we came to the end of the negotiation, when it finally became clear that we were going to get across the finish line. This would be the night of July 13th. There was discussion among the foreign ministers in particular that in the end, therefore, the success of this format, the P5+1, the direct engagement over a long period of time on tough issues, hanging together on that, could be a very important model for a number of other challenges, and there was some discussion about that in some specific areas that might be prone to some progress in that way. But if you look specifically at the possibilities of enhancing the IAEA's processes, et cetera, there were definitely steps taken. One is that the acceptance by Iran of the agency's use of advanced technologies, advanced safeguards technologies. They are in use in some places, but real-time enrichment monitoring, electronic seals, et cetera. These are that's a direction that we need to have, in some sense, applied everywhere, and this may help that. But also, breaking completely new ground is the transparencies into the uranium supply chain. That's something the agency would like to do a lot more of, but has never been able to get implemented. So this is a first there. So I think I think I would I at least hope that eventually the Iran situation might be viewed as a kind of almost pushing the edge in a positive way of the whole approach to safeguards in a way that could be much more ubiquitous. Yeah.
Okay, Thorshan, another member of our board. Microphone right behind you.
Secretary Moniz, we are very happy to have you here. Sig Heckert, who I know we have had speak here and we all respect.
Who's he?
He says that you are in charge of making sure that this agreement is airtight and will protect all of us from the dangers that Iran could cause for the world. Could you tell us on a very high level, in your view, what are the issues that you feel in this agreement are really the strong points that are your successes? And if possible, what are the issues that you believe are still works in progress?
By the way, first of all, SIG, of course, has been and continues to be an enormous contributor in terms of our nuclear security issues, and including in many countries that he somehow manages to visit and get into interesting facilities. And he will be, I don't know, he may know, he's, for the aside, but he's working on a very extensive description of the remarkable cooperation between the nuclear weapons establishments in the United States and Russia during some very, very difficult periods, and so that's going to be quite interesting. Well, the agreement, again, I think has a number of strengths. I mean, to be honest, and again, certainly for the first decade, the set of constraints that blocks Iranian pathways is extremely strong. I mentioned them earlier, just to repeat, but I think the 15-year limit on the uranium stockpile of low-enriched uranium is really a very powerful constraint. Frankly, we should understand that to operate for the approved program, Iranian program, to function, you need some stockpile. It cannot be zero to operate the system. So this is really getting, in some sense, to a kind of a minimal amount. Today, as we've said, today's stockpile is sufficient for something in the 10, 12 weapons worth arena, and we are talking about a 97, 98% reduction from that, let's say, 10 weapons worth. So it's really quite a restriction for 15 years. I mentioned earlier that plutonium restrictions are quite strong. I did not mention earlier, but let me mention another example. On the R&D side, there's a lot of discussion about the IR-8, a machine that would be, let's say, the order of 15 times more powerful than the IR-1. But forgetting that today they have one machine which is operating without uranium gas. On the other hand, if you take the next generation machine from what they currently have, sorry for all the acronyms, but the IR-2M and the IR-4, let's say these are on the order of 5 times more powerful than the current machine. Those, in both cases, they are already operating what are called full lead cascades. In this case, it's around 164 machines all plumbed together, doing enrichment. They're already operating these full lead cascades. What does the agreement do? For the next 10 years, they can do R&D on 0 IR-2Ms and up a cascade of up to 10 IR-4s when they're already doing 164. So that's the next machine of considerable improved capacity, and it's rolled back substantially. Well, maybe it's our fault. There isn't enough attention provided, I think, to that. So, look, I think that, frankly, these restrictions over 15 years on their peaceful program are quite substantial, and the hope, of course, is that they, over that period of time, Iran will be able to, let's say, regain some trust in the international community in terms of their intentions and their activities, but that will be covered by constant enhanced verification in any case.
We have about 10 minutes left. We have 4 more speakers, so what I'd like to do is to take 2 and 2,
Okay.
if that's okay. First, Michael Froy, who is also a member of our board, and then Elisa Harris from the Center for International and Security Studies at the University of Maryland.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us this morning. I have a question that's sort of the flip side of Kay's question, and that is, what worries you about this agreement? What keeps you up at night? And I'd like you to comment on at least one aspect of the technical considerations, and that is, over a 15-year period, how comfortable can we be that there won't be significant improvements in technology that would significantly reduce the breakout period and therefore really diminish some of the conceptual protections and time frame protections that are in the current agreement?
And Elisa Harris.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, I was wondering if you could tell us whether the U.S. intelligence community has done an assessment of the verifiability of this agreement. I'm sure that you had intelligence experts on your negotiating team, but in the past, when the United States has entered into agreements with other countries of this type, the intelligence community has done a sort of independent assessment of the final agreement. So I'm wondering, has this been done, and if so, where did they come out? Thank you.
You can guess I'll answer half of that question. What worries me the most is a set of discussions going on that either started before there was an agreement or after the agreement addressed peripheral issues. For example, I mentioned earlier, this red herring of the secret side agreements as a major focus of discussion, as opposed to the kinds of core issues which many around this table have raised in this discussion. This is a more elevated discussion than I am sometimes subjected to, shall I say, in terms of addressing the real issues. And frankly, that is more disturbing than anything in this agreement, which I believe very clearly addresses the goal of the agreement in terms of the weapons program. As I said earlier, look, I think the first thing I said was, look, the president made a strategic decision that a negotiation focused on nuclear weapons would be the pathway to progress and to ultimately to improve security by removing the existential threat. Now, look, I think that strategic decision is one that could be debated. Historians may debate it. It could have been debated a few years ago, and it wasn't. But now isn't the time to debate that. Now is the time to decide what is the optimum path forward. And clearly, as I've said, if this agreement is undermined in the Congress, the discussion about the day after is not very pretty. So, to be honest, I think that's really what really keeps me up at night. Now, in 15 years, will there be technology improvement? I think the answer is almost certainly yes. Will there be a lot less than there would have been without the agreement? Absolutely. I've already mentioned the IR-2M and the IR-4, but take the IR-6, the next one. It's pretty clear. The time compared to their R&D plan, versus the strictures here, it's going to be nearly a decade delay before they get to kind of a largish lead cascade kind of activity. So the first point is it's your reference frame. Number one, there will be a lot less progress than there would have been otherwise. Secondly, again, as I said earlier, today, and in fact, the JPOA, the interim agreement, is the first time that the program has been in many ways, kind of frozen in many aspects, rolled back a little bit in some aspects. But let's say if we go to the beginning of the JPOA, 19,000 plus centrifuges and 12,000 kilograms of material. There's not a lot of shortening of breakout time from that capacity. They had plenty of capacity to go there, and as you saw, they also had hundreds of kilograms of 20% uranium, which already a lot of which has been blended down and will be eliminated. So at worst case scenario, you can say, okay, in 15 years, they're back to a pretty short breakout time, but with additional provisions on weaponization and with considerable additional verification. Again, the alternative is plenty of capacity and essentially no verification today. Oh, I'm sorry, intelligence assessment. You're absolutely correct. That standard procedure would be an independent intelligence assessment. That has been done. It has been supplied to the Congress. Obviously, it's classified, and I can't describe its content in detail, but I can repeat what, again, General Clapper said last week, that there is substantially enhanced insight into their program through this agreement.
Finally, Charles Moore, also a member of our board, and then Alan Schriesheim, former director of Argonne, and now the head of that other Chicago Council on Science and Technology.
Mr. Secretary, I want to follow up on Emma and Kay's question. Is the P5 in the United States exhausted by this whole effort? Are they anxious to get back to business with Iran? Or is there going to be vigorous monitoring and follow-up? Skeptics might say the administration's got a history of declaring victory, and then maybe the aftermath isn't so good. Alan?
Your comment with respect to SIG and all our relationships with the Soviet Union, post-Soviet Union, reminded me that during the height of the Cold War, we in the Soviet Union had scientific exchange. We had still people in their labs, even in some of the closed cities, and people in our labs. It's sort of a detailed question, I guess. But one of the best ways to figure out what's actually going on is to have joint research programs. So I wonder, in the protocols, are there provisions for that kind of activity that we had in the past? Because I remember being debriefed by all kinds of people after being over there. So that's the question.
Right. Okay, well, so on the first question, kind of back to business, look, there's no question that with our secondary sanctions lifted and or suspended, I should always say suspended, by the way, in all these cases, EU, et cetera. Clearly the expectation is that there will be, an uptick, if you like, in business, certainly a reinvestment into the petroleum sector, for example, among other things. But on the other hand, we also shouldn't forget that there will remain in place many, many sanctions on Iran. What are being suspended are the specific nuclear-derived sanctions, not the sanctions that derive from other activities, terrorism, human rights violations, et cetera. They remain in place. Indeed, our prerogative for new sanctions for these non-nuclear activities remains in place, even if they are in compliance with the nuclear agreement. And by the way, there have been significant additional designations by the U.S. government, for example, again, involving Hezbollah, just in the last 2 weeks. So that is business as usual as far as we are concerned. And by the way, the U.S. trade embargo remains in place. So American companies, for example, will not be part of that. Any rush to Tehran, that remains reality. The issue of sustained focus is very important, and it's good that you raised that. I think that we need that in two ways. One is going to be on implementation of the nuclear agreement, and we'll obviously do things like contribute to additional resources for the IAEA to carry out this program. It's going to be by far the biggest safeguards effort that the agency's been asked to make, and round numbers, we're probably talking about a $10 million per year incremental budget, for example, just to implement this program, and that's even using the advanced technologies to gain some efficiencies. But I want to emphasize that the sustained focus is going to have to be not only on the nuclear agreement, but upon all those other regional issues that are critical. So I think, if anything, it's going to require, kind of a stepped-up focus on some of the terrorist activities. It's going to depend. We got to resolve the Syria issue, where obviously Iran is supporting Assad, for example. So I think that's another area where we have to really focus on that. Look at what just happened this week. As I said, with Secretary Kerry and the GCC foreign ministers with some pretty specific additional security collaborations. So Just for example, obviously Saudi Arabia is very concerned about the Yemen situation. But we know that that the issue of dealing with the Houthis is not, it's probably less a question of some of the conventional firepower capabilities as it is in terms of truly enhancing, let's say, special forces capabilities. So we're going to be in a lot of, it's not only hardware, it's also different kinds of training focus, et cetera. So this is all going to need a sustained focus, but the idea is without the issue of the nuclear weapon being on the table. So that's really the whole posture. Finally, ending with Al, and this is great that I can get back to my day job with Al's question involving DOE National Laboratories. Let me first take advantage of the opportunity for an advertisement. Frankly, when Mr. Salehi and I were thrust into the negotiations in late February, the role of DOE became suddenly it wasn't a secret anymore. But I want to emphasize that our national laboratories underpinned this negotiation for its entire run. It's just that it wasn't kind of coming out. And some of you may have seen there was a New York Times front page article that correctly stated that 9 of our places, 7 laboratories and 2 sites, provided ongoing support. Many of them with very different focuses. I'll just say Argonne, for example, your laboratory here. In particular, Argonne on things like the Iraq reactor, the plutonium production reactor. So that was really a huge thing. Now, in terms of cooperation, international scientific cooperation, there is no doubt that was a focus. Specifically, for example, if you look at the agreement, I didn't even talk about Fordo today, the underground or under the mountain facility. Now, so it's going to have no enrichment R&D, no fissile material entering the place. But it does say that it will be converted into a kind of a physics, nuclear, stable isotope laboratory with international collaboration. So that international collaboration is very important for the reasons you said, Al, but frankly, it's also important because it gives transparency and an international presence in that facility. So we are serious about wanting to see that happen. Now, initially, frankly, it's probably going to happen more with other countries than with the United States. The fact is we don't have diplomatic relations in contrast to our other negotiating partners. I personally think at some point, clearly not nuclear involved for us, but there may be some opportunities for some enhanced scientific collaboration. But the international community for sure will, and I think must, pick up the pace on that.
Mr. Secretary, we've run out of our time, but I want to thank you so much for coming here this morning to help continue our unbroken record of elevated discussions at the Chicago Council.
I appreciate that.
You certainly contributed to it. I think this was an extraordinarily well-spent hour in which we really did get the insights on the agreement. So thank you so much for being with us.
I certainly hope it's helpful in terms of explicating the agreement, and we think it stands, with hard analysis, we believe it stands on its own 2 feet quite well. So the chance to have this kind of a discussion is appreciated.
It's great. So please join me in welcoming. Thank you. Thank you so much.